Welcome again to the University of Nottingham. With me today I've Dr. David Monkton, and he's going to explore with us the traditional understanding of the Eucharist in Methodism. David, you're very welcome.
Oh, thank you very much indeed, Tom. Thank you.
The Eucharist in Methodism. Everything in Methodism seems to start with the Wesleys, so I presume you're going to start there.
Yes, more or less there anyway, but I want to tell you a rather funny story that happened a few months ago. I went to a small Methodist church in Derbyshire, and they were telling me the story about some children that had come in wandering into church and just curious to know what went on there. And the communion steward was preparing the table for the communion service later that morning. It was a Sunday morning when they were there. And one of the children said, "Is God under that cloth?" And I thought that was a lovely opening to the whole subject in a way. How do we understand what the Eucharist is all about? And how does Methodism look at that particularly? And it does start with John and Charles Wesley, because a lot of people don't realise that John and Charles Wesley, they were not only very avid evangelists, as you might say, but they were very keen for regular Holy Communion. Very regular, and they encouraged Methodists as often as they could to go to the Eucharist. And well, if you look at what happened in Methodism, you discover that Charles wrote lots of wonderful hymns, but he wrote a lot of Eucharistic hymns. And it is from the Eucharistic hymns that we really learn a great deal about the Methodist understanding of what the Eucharist is all about.
Okay, well, would you like to take us through some of this Eucharistic understanding that we find in the hymns?
Yes. I think just before I do that, I'm rather keen on that phrase of Augustine, you know, that he who sings praise twice. That's right, praise twice. And it occurs to me that if we sing our theology well, how quickly we learn it. And Methodists traditionally have been very good at the theology of the sacrament, but they would never think of themselves as theologians really, because there's a tremendous amount of material there that is of a very high church tradition. And often people looking at Methodism think Methodism isn't a high church at all. Right. And I think I would describe the Methodist Church's view on the Eucharist as being high church, as it were, without the ritual and without the actions that one finds in the high church tradition.
So high church in theology, low church in appearance.
Fair enough, yes, okay. And I would like to illustrate what all this is about, really, by looking at one of Charles Wesley's hymns on the Eucharist, because I think by looking at one of the hymns we can understand a great deal of what Methodist doctrine is.
And of course for Methodists, the hymn book was a little bit like a catechism or a theology manual.
It certainly was. In some ways one could illustrate very well with the information that I've got here. There's a very large hymn book from 100 years ago, and there's a very small book of offices that was used for quite a long time. And now we have quite a large book of offices, and we tend to use our hymns less than we used to.
All right.
And I think that's a mistake, really.
Okay.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Would you like to take us through one of these hymns?
Yes, I'll do that. The hymn is the hymn, Jesus we thus obey, thy last and kindest word. Here in thine own appointed way, we come to meet thee, Lord. That's a very well-known hymn, sung very frequently even today in our churches. The mandate, in fact, to attend Holy Communion is seen as a call from Christ himself. And it's not from the institution of the Church. we have to bear in mind, for instance, that Methodism wasn't a church for a very long time. But it was the request that Jesus made himself to the disciples. And because he invites us, then there's a sense in which we see his presence there with us in the communion service itself, at other times as well, but particularly in the communion. And it was often seen as a meal, often called the Lord's Supper, and very much, I think, along the lines of the German Protestant churches, where they think of Abendmahl and for
Abendmahl, evening
meal, yes. And it's rather interesting that we still frequently have an evening communion in Methodist churches, although the majority of people these days, of course, take Holy Communion on a Sunday morning.
Right.
Well, in the first verse we have this sense of Jesus himself inviting us to share the meal with him. It's not an instruction, it's not an advice, it's Jesus' personal invitation for people to be there with him at a meal. And there is this sense of sharing bread and wine together. And the second verse says this: our hearts we open wide to make the Saviour room, and lo, the Lamb, the crucified, the sinner's friend is come. And in that verse we have very much this sense of those who follow Christ being there with him, opening their hearts up, their inner being, as they enter into this particular service, and remembering that Christ is there, seen in this hymn as the Lamb, the crucified, and the one who is the friend of sinners. There's this sense of entering emotionally with our whole personalities into what the crucifixion of Jesus really means to us as individuals, but also as a fellowship together. We open our hearts so that Christ can enter our lives, and Jesus himself is described as the Lamb, the crucified. And here we may know his friendship towards sinful humanity, and he actually comes alongside us in worship. The phrase, the crucified, keeps us focused on the giving of himself on the cross. And as we willingly respond, so he enters into our lives and transforms us to take to ourselves his life as we do that. The next verse says this: his presence makes the feast, and now our spirits feel the glory not to be expressed, the joy unspeakable. This verse, more plain than any other, reminds us that the doctrine of the real presence is central to the meaning of the Eucharist. However, this to us is far removed from theological argument, and we might think of the medieval theology, where there's a tremendous amount of controversy as to what this exactly meant by his presence being with us. The rather interesting thing is that in this hymn also, the original version said, his presence makes the feast, and now our bosoms feel. I think quite rightly they got rid of the word bosoms, because obviously we use the word now in a very kind of sexual way. And so the hymn writers, the revisers of Wesley's hymns changed that one a little bit. But it's nevertheless true to say that we serve Christ and worship in the Eucharist in a heartfelt way, and our spirits feel at one with him. And so we still keep the experiential warmth of faith, which goes beyond language. And I think that's important as well, that it isn't just the words, it is the experience of entering into what happens at the Eucharist. And the next verse reads, with pure celestial bliss, he doth our spirits cheer. His house of banqueting is this, and he has brought us here. And here there's the element of ecstasy that's expressed that can be part of the experience of faith. And it is not only a sober remembrance of his death, a kind of cerebral celebration, for want of a better phrase, of what we're doing at the Holy Communion, but it is a touching on the lines of what heavenly celestial bliss is all about. And there is also here a hint of the Messianic banquet, which all are invited to in the last days. It seems to me that the Wesley experience of faith has what we might call a strong touch of a realised eschatology about it. In other words, through the Spirit, the intimate presence of Christ is considered to be just as important and as real with us now as in some future day at the end of the age. And bliss, I think that Wesley's equate this with rapture. And when you go into the use of the word rapture, of course, you're into an area of fun and games in modern theology, I think, especially when you think in terms of many schools of thought in America that have a very strong emphasis on rapture. But Wesley didn't use the word rapture in the kind of technical sense that many people use it today. He saw rapture in the present equally as valid as rapture in the future. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. But one of the things that interests me is that, writing in an 18th century context, the Wesleys are emphasising the Eucharist as feast and banquet.
This is right, and also there is this strong element of joy about it as well, I think. But not like any good meal, you know, there's the celebration that's extremely important. Yeah.
You mentioned the idea of presence, but it wasn't trying to tie presence down in any philosophical or theological jargon.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting, of course, that the idea of presence is a fundamental religious idea.
Yes.
That we become present to God and God becomes present to us.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that for Methodists, in using hymns as prayer,
yes,
you could create a theology of real presence,
yeah,
and yet at the same time avoid
yes,
the sort of arid debates.
That's right, yes. There's another verse to this hymn, by the way, that touches on this very theme, of course. He bids us eat, drink and eat imperishable food. He gives his flesh to be our meat and bids us drink his blood. Now, you could say this is a very difficult area. I don't know whether you're familiar with the writings of John Dominic Crossan at all, are you?
Yes, I know John Dominic Crossan, yes.
Oh yes, well, he's got a saying, something along the lines that it is not that ancient people told literal stories and we are now smart enough to believe them symbolically, but that they told them symbolically and we are now dumb enough to take them literally. And I don't think Wesley ever meant that to be taken literally, but it was symbolic language. And Jesus meant it that way as well.
On that point, we will just say, David, thank you very much.